Let me start by just telling you my story in the sense of the church here, how I got here, and right to this particular place today. My dad was in the Navy for 22 years, retired when I was 12, and by then I had been in 16 schools. Let's see, no, the other way around. We moved 16 times. I was in 23 schools, changed schools several times between moves, and so that was a big part of my life in the sense of my upbringing. And when I was 12, we got the first farm. Dad talked about farming. That's all he talked about all my growing up years. In fact, every weekend, it didn't make any difference if we were stationed in San Diego or Alaska. Every weekend, we would go tour farms. He would call a local real estate agent up and make it sound like he was ready to buy right then, and they would take us out and show us farms in the area. Sometimes there were cattle ranches, sometimes there were wheat ranches. We went and saw a watermelon farm down in the Bay Area. That was my favorite. I really wanted that one, and dairies, etc. And so I just grew up farming mentality. That's what I was going to do. And so when I was 12, we got our first farm. And then in 1965, we sold that one and then moved up to Trout Lake, Washington, and got the dairy. Well, that was my high school years. And my mom still lives there. My brother still lives there. My sister still lives there. They're there, and that's where I go regularly to see my family. And my desire was to be a farmer. That's all I ever wanted to do. I went to college when I graduated from high school in 1967 because in Trout Lake there were 12 girls in the entire high school. That's how big the school was. And I had dated all of them a number of times and didn't want to marry any of them. And so I was in a dilemma. I didn't know where to. I asked my pastor what I should do, and he said, well, go to a Christian college. You can find a wife there. So that's why I went to college, to find a wife. And so it took me 2 years. And when I found my wife and we got married, then I came back to the farm. And we farmed for a number of years, Darien with my father, and then decided to come back and finish my schooling. I went 2 years here at Salem at Western Baptist College. Worked out an arrangement with my dad to leave the arrangement we had there and came down in 1973. And they told me I needed a Christian service assignment. That was part of the schooling, the education requirement. And so the general director for the Conservative Baptist was then in Salem, and Dr. Losi was his name, and I went and said, I need a Christian service assignment, and the church I grew up in Trout Lake is a really little church, and so I'd like to find a really little church in the area. And he said, well, they're going to start a church in Jefferson in a couple of months, and if you'd like, you can plug in there. And I said, well, that'd be great. And it was Bart Marshall was a pastor in Salem, and he was going to start this church. And so I was at the first service. My wife and I, we didn't have any kids, and we met up here in town in the concert hall, and we went a couple of years, and then I graduated in 75, went back to the dairy, and was going to settle down and farm for the rest of my life. And we had our first child. We'd been married 6 years. Doctor told us we had about a 1 in 10,000 chance of having children, and so that was a great miracle. And so I graduated from college, had a baby, went back to the farm. Everything I ever wanted, I had. And so we farmed for about a year and a half. Patty was going to go down and visit her parents in the Bay Area, and we didn't have a lot of money, so she was going to take the train. We drove to Portland, which Trout Lake is north of Hood River, right at the base of Mount Adams. It's about a 90-minute drive to Portland, and we were late just by about 60 seconds. The train was just pulling out. And the guy there, the conductor or whatever, whoever he sold the tickets, he says, you know, you could drive, if you drive 70 miles an hour, you can beat the train to Salem. Now, I had a 1960 Volkswagen, and floorboarded, it would go 72, as long as you weren't going up a hill. And so we took off, drove as fast as my car would go down Salem, pulled into the train thing, followed the signs off the freeway, pulled right in. Just as it was pulling in, Patty jumped out of the car, grabbed her suitcase, and she ran, jumped on the train, and away she went. And so I was in Salem. I thought, I'm this close, I might as well drive down to Jefferson and see how things are going. Been a year and a half, drove in to one of the farmers that was going to church, one of the deacons in the church. We talked about farming and price of wheat and all that kind of good stuff. I asked how the church was going, and he says, well, the pastor who started the church resigned. He's going back to seminary, and things aren't going real well, and on and on. And I said, that was too bad. Walked out the door, ready to go back home, and as I walked out the door, he said, you know, you should come back and be our pastor. I laughed out loud. I said, yeah, right. I was, or I guess I should say I am, the most antisocial introverted individual God has ever made. My basic philosophy is that cows are considerably easier to get along with than people, a whole lot easier to work with. And just because of the nature of my growing up years, where we moved as many times as we moved, I never made any friends. Mom really was suspicious of a lot of the kids in Navy housing anyway, and she'd take us to school, pick us up. I never really made any friends. Then when we did settle down, it was in a community where there were 20 kids in the high school. And so most of my growing up years, I really never had friends, and when I did, they were a very small group, and I never had to meet people I didn't know. And so the thought of being a pastor was just sort of like ridiculous. But it was something about the way he said it. I don't know what it was. God just didn't let me get rid of it. And so for the next number of months, I just struggled big time with this thing. And finally, I had gone to a seminar where the speaker said, if you really want to know God's will, you need to get your father's counsel. Well, my dad, I knew what he would say. One of his favorite words was foolishness. Girls were foolishness, cars were foolishness, anything but work was foolishness. And so I thought, I'm going to ask my dad. And I could hear him say it. When I said, Dad, what do you think? Should I walk away from this dairy and go be a pastor? And he'd say, foolishness. So one day I asked, we were leaning against the fence looking out, the heifers trying to decide which one was going to calf next, and I said, Dad, they want me to come down and be a pastor of a church of 12 people that doesn't have any building, they don't have any money. What do you think? And he said, I think you should do it for a year. He said, you go down there and pastor for a year. He said, they'll beat you up, make life miserable for you. Then you can come back and you can farm, and we'll just be done with this church stuff. The only thing we ever fought about was how much time I invested in church up there, and Dad figured this would kind of get it out of my system, I guess. And I'd made this deal with God that whatever Dad said I'd do. So I was kind of stuck with it, and so I came down in 1976 to be the pastor here for 1 year, and the year drug on, went beyond a year, and things went fairly well for the first couple of years. I didn't know what I was doing. The first time, it was a couple of months after I started, somebody said, would you do a funeral? I forget the relative that died, and so I said, well, okay, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. I called Bart Marshall in Salem. I said, Bart, I got to do a funeral, and I don't know how to do a funeral. I've only been to one in my life, and that was when I was a real little kid. He said, okay, and so I went to his office. He pulled out the paper, and he looked there to see, and he said, oh, here, they're having a funeral right now. Let's go, and we hopped in his car, and we went to this funeral. And we sat there, went through it was in a thing, and all the time he's telling me stuff, and I'm taking notes, and I said, okay. So I went back and did the funeral, and a little bit later, somebody wanted me to do a wedding, and I'd only been to 2 weddings. One of them was mine, and I only was half conscious through it. And so I called Bart. I said, Bart, I got to do this wedding. He said, and so I showed up at his office, and he looked in the paper, and sure enough, there was a wedding happening just a little bit. So we drove to this church where the wedding was going on, and we sat there, and he talked me through the thing, what they did. He said, I wouldn't do it that way. He just gave me some counsel and advice, and came back, did the wedding, and it's everything, first communion service, first business meeting, everything. I went and asked Bart what to do, and back then they required me to do 20 cold calls a week, and they would pay me $600 a month to Conservative Baptist. It was called Mission Aid. First year, $600, next year, $400, and the last year, $300. I forget the exact numbers, but it was kind of that kind of. But in order to get the money, I had to send this piece of paper in that I said I made these cold calls. Well, it just scared me to death. Absolutely petrified me to walk up and knock on a door with somebody I didn't know. And so I called Bart, and he said, oh, come up. And so we took off from his office and walked up the street, knocked on a door, and he did all the talking and walked on another street. And about the 4th or 5th house, he knocked on the door, and he said, hello, my name is Bart Marshall. I pastor the church down the street. This is my friend. He pastors in Jefferson, and he wants to talk to you. And and we managed to get through that whole ordeal, but that's kind of how it began. Most everything I did I just didn't know what I was doing, and learned as we went along. Things went fairly well. Church grew. We bought this piece of property, got it a real steal on it because it was not approved for septic. And we thought, well, we'll never get to be past a church of 100, and we'll just put a storage tank in. Applied and got permission to do that. You just have to pump it out every 2 weeks. That was back when you could pump things out cheap. And so we put spigots on that it would pop shut, and low flow toilets and all that kind of stuff. We told people go to the bathroom before you come to church. And so we managed to buy the property, and we built the first building and moved in 1979. And we broke 100 people the first time when we did that. And we finally grew up to a church of about 200 after 5 years. And I thought I should probably write a book. And thought I was fairly successful. And it was about then that we had a major exodus of people that left. In fact, about half the people in the church left. And I went and saw Bard. I said, what do I do? He said, well, you need to go visit all those people who leave. I said, I don't want to visit them. They don't like me. And I'm not sure I like them either. And he said, no, you got to go visit them and find out what the deal is, what the problem is, so you can fix it. So I did. I made appointments, went and saw them. And every place I went, it was the same thing. Their answer, their reason for leaving was they didn't feel like I loved them. And I didn't know how to fix that. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know if it meant I had to hug them. I wasn't particularly into that. But I thought, if I've learned how to do weddings and funerals and the rest, I guess I can learn how to hug people. If I need to do that. But it was just every time I talked, that was the issue. And really what it boiled down to was what my wife said. She said, I could offend more people from my office to the pulpit than anybody she knew. And I didn't say anything to them. That was the problem. I just figured I didn't have anything to say. I really wasn't into chit-chat. I was thinking about my sermon anyway. And I just was, as my wife said, socially retarded and offended people and irritated people, and I didn't do it on purpose, just the way I was. And so I thought, well, I went to some seminars. I went to big church seminars and got some books on church growth and started some programs, worked harder than I'd worked before, and the church grew back up some more, and then we had another exodus, and pretty much the same thing, from 200 to 100 people. And I didn't need to go do the interview. I knew what I'd hear. It was the same old problem. And so I worked harder. My dad's motto was there was nothing you couldn't accomplish if you were just willing to work hard enough. And so I worked harder, put in more hours, started more programs, read more books, went to more seminars, and make a long story short, went through it again. And at the end of 1988, we had 88 people come into church. And I was very, very burnt out and discouraged. And the really bad thing is my dad had sold the farm to my brother. I was looking in Hoard's Dairyman for herdsman jobs at dairies. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew that I just couldn't keep doing what I was doing. I just wasn't wired for it. I didn't like people, and they didn't like me. As long as I could just stand up here and preach to them, I did all right. It was when I had a visit with them that I got into trouble. I tried just doing things with Patty, my wife. She's really outgrowing. Everybody loves her, and so I just would let her talk, and I'd stand behind her, nod my head, and smile. That helped. It did a lot, but it didn't solve all the problems. And it was about then I got a letter from Dr. Joe Aldridge at Multnomah, and he said something about Oregon being the least church state in the United States, and Marion County being the worst county, and that we needed to get the pastors in Marion County to pray. And they had the first ever prayer summit over at Cannon Beach and invited me to go. And there were several things in the letter that I didn't like. One of them was there was no agenda. I hate things with no agenda. My wife says I don't even go to the bathroom without first making a goal to do it. That's an overstatement, but that there was these guys from all these different denominations. Now, I basically had grown up in a conservative Baptist church. I wasn't sure anybody else was even saved. And so to go over and spend 4 days with these guys praying together, I wasn't sure what they were going to try to get me to do or whatever, but there was nothing about this thing that appealed to me. So I threw the letter in the garbage can, and a couple of days later got a second one, and they said a fellow or a company, somebody had given some money as a grant to pay the way of those pastors of small churches that didn't have a lot of money, and you could apply and get it. So I did. I thought, well, and I got, they said they would pay the $179 or whatever the cost was, and I thought, well, this is what I'll do. I'll go, skip the prayer sessions, walk on the beach, eat the food, figure out what I'm going to do with my life, write my letter of resignation, and just kind of get my head clear. And so I went, and I thought I should probably go to the first prayer meeting just to have some degree of integrity. And I went to the first prayer time, and it only took about 15 minutes before God really began to beat me up. And it was sort of like he just turned me inside out, and I saw me. I saw my heart, my motive, everything that was driving me. It just sort of was out there. And it just, the scariest thing about it was discovering information that was there that I really had no clue about. And I became just very aware of my arrogance, my self-sufficiency, my independence, my thought that I could make this thing work if I worked hard enough and started enough programs that I could figure it out. I really discovered that what my motive was in wanting the church to grow. And I really did discover that I didn't love people. And it really was nothing about my temperament or my personality. And so for 4 days, I basically cried. I didn't do much of that growing up. My dad was a cross between Archie Bunker and John Wayne. And I mean, you didn't cry. Hurt yourself, drop the wagon tongue in your toe and break all 4 toes or 4 toes. You didn't fuss, you just kept working. That was the way my dad was. And I was kind of embarrassed about myself. Every time I opened my mouth to try to pray, I just cried. Because of a lot of what had gone on, the emotional burnout that I had gone through and experienced, and all of a sudden this sort of revelation about who I was and what I was doing and all that there was just lots of stuff there. And we went over on a bus, and we came back on a bus, and I got on the bus, headed home after 4 days there, and I was sort of in a quandary about what I was going to do. I'd made up my mind to quit, to leave ministry, because I just thought that somewhere along the line I made a mistake in thinking that God had called me. And I just wasted 13 years of my life. And so I had a yellow legal pad, and I just wrote down some goals. And they all had to do with prayer. The first one, I wrote down I was going to pray for 3 hours a day. Now, it was an interesting number in that my prayer life up to that point was maybe 15 minutes a day at best. So it was a radical jump, but I thought, I got to figure something out. I just finished reading a book. It was an old book. Somebody had picked it up in a book sale, a garage sale. I don't know where they got it, but they gave it to me, and in the cover was 75 cents. That's how much they paid for it. And in the cover, as a bookmark, was a 5x7 card. And on the 5x7 card, there were written about a dozen different names. Martin Luther, 3 hours. David Brainerd, 3 hours. Jonathan Edwards, 3 hours. After every one of these dozen names I recognized was the term 3 hours. Including the biography of George Mueller, of what the book was. So, wow, that seems to be kind of a common number, and so I wrote down that's going to be my goal, see if I can turn things around. And I wrote 6 other goals in regards to prayer. One of them was to pray with my wife, something that she'd been begging me to do, along with others. And I thought, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to really give this prayer thing a shot. It may not change anything in the church, but hopefully it's going to change something in me. Because that was my problem, and I discovered what that was while I was there. And so when I came back, I stood up in front of the church, and I basically confessed to them my prayerlessness. And the worst thing about that particular Sunday is I blubbered all over again. I thought I could certainly get by without doing it, but I did. And I said, I don't know, what I'm going to do, but I know one thing: I'm going to pray. And so we're going to have a prayer meeting tonight in the kitchen, and we're going to have one the next morning and the next night, and we're just going to do this every morning, every night in the kitchen, and all I want is 1 or 2 to show up. Well, the first one, everybody showed up. They thought maybe I'd gotten saved or something, and revival was coming, and it dwindled down, just 1 or 2 coming, but it's persisted over the years, and God began to work in our church and in my life, and it was the most freeing thing for me to discover that God really will build His church. And it really will bless His church if I would trust Him and rely on Him and pray. And so that was 15 years ago. And so I've been doing it 2 ways. The first 13 years my way, the last 15 years God's way. Now, I haven't changed a whole lot in the sense that I'm still very much of an introvert, and I'm much more comfortable with cows than people still, even though I'm not a dairy farmer. And I like being around people I know. I'm very uncomfortable meeting people I don't know. I do it, I work at it diligently, and I'm trying to acquire more skill in that all the time. But I still occasionally kind of figure out from people that I make them nervous by my inability to make small talk and chit-chat, that kind of stuff. But one of the things that has changed dramatically, and we'll get into that when we get into that part of it, is I really do truly love people now. And that God has done that in me through the avenue of praying for them. And even though some of the mechanics are not there, and it's interesting how we can kind of sense that. I remember back when I used to ask people what they meant by that, they couldn't give me an answer. They just said, I just kind of know it. And people sense when we love them and when we don't. And when we're tolerating them and when we're using them, and when they're really important to us.